Our last speaker is Ariel Zinder from Tel Aviv University. He received his PhD at Hebrew University and just now became part of the literature department at Tel Aviv. And again, he was a fellow of the PhD honors program. His research interests include Hebrew liturgical poetry, Andalusian Hebrew poetry of the 11th and 12th century, liturgical and ritual studies, and lyric theory, antique and current. Let me just add that he's also a poet and a prominent figure in the cultural scene here in Jerusalem, and a translator. So, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. Ilana, you probably don't remember, but the first paper I ever submitted to you was on Psalm 121. As far as I'm concerned, that happened yesterday, so I'm very happy to be here. What I'd like to share with you today is part of my wider interest in the representations of God's speech in Hebrew poetry, both biblical and post-biblical, going into piyut and modern Israeli poetry. I began preparing this paper thinking I'd arrive at piyut, but some matters inside the songs themselves that seemed to me both personally and intellectually urgent made me present a reading of two songs, which have repercussions and important implications for later times. But the paper itself is a reading of the two songs themselves. When God speaks to someone in the Hebrew Bible, his voice is usually a disquieting voice. Rarely does he speak to someone or of someone just in order to agree with him or with his present condition. Even in those rare cases when he commends someone and reaffirms his faith in that person, it is almost always in order to assign him yet another task or test, or to promise him some distant future. I have seen that you alone in this generation are righteous before me, says God to Noah, and sends him off to build an ark. I am with you and I will guard you wherever you may go, God says to Jacob, as the ancient father embarks on a journey into unknown lands of exile and family intrigue. In these cases and many more, God speaks, voices a command, a warning, a promise, as a way of intervening in the course of events, changing them, thrusting his addressee forward, challenging him, preventing him from dwelling peacefully in the present. It is a voice that, no matter how affectionate it may sound, always produces and safeguards the gap between the divine and human spheres. But how does God speak in the book of Psalms? Do his appearances as a dramatic persona in these poems resonate with the same disquieting interventionist tone, or does he do other things with his divine words? As a partial answer to this question, I'd like to focus on God's dramatic appearances in two Psalms. I'd like to share with you a close reading, a critical reading of some key verses in these poems in order to present a certain paradigm of the divine in the book of Psalms, but also in order to point to the inner fractures that this paradigm bears within it. Generally speaking, God doesn't appear very often as a speaker in the book of Psalms. Less than 20 Psalms contain some direct representation of his words. Among those, 4 are royal Psalms, namely those poems dedicated to the image of a king and to the legitimacy and grandeur of his rule. And there are various versions as to how many of these royal Psalms are, but somewhere between 11 and 40. 2 of these royal Psalms, Psalms 2 and 89, include rather long divine speeches. As biblical scholars teach us, these poems resonate with motifs from nearby societies and may have been recited at official coronation rituals. So we might assume that these divine speeches were performed ritually, but we could also address the literary fact that God appears there as a persona worthy of a literary reading. We begin with Psalm 2. I'll be reading from the Hebrew, but on the screen here we'll have Robert Alter's truly majestic translation. So this is Psalm 2. למה רגשו גויים ולאומים יהגו ריק, התייצבו מלכי ארץ ורוזנים נוסדו יחד על אדוני ועל משיחו. ננתקה את מוסרותימו ונשליכה ממנו אבותימו, יושב בשמיים ישחק, אדוני ילעג לנו, אז ידבר אלינו באפו ובחרונו יבהלנו, ואני נסחתי מלכי על ציון הר קודשי. So the first sound God makes in Psalms is this laughter, this sarcastic dismissal of the words of the kings of the earth. They are trying to interfere with the sovereignty of God and King, and his laugh is meant to make clear that their attempts are futile. And indeed the laugh is followed by an avowal of divine loyalty. I appointed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. He is my king on my mountain, God says. As you observe this king, he's saying, do not think you're encountering a merely political, merely human phenomenon. Do not attack him. He is my representative, immune to attack by force of my choice, of other rituals, of topography, by force of the voice speaking so highly of him. And so we have it. As early as the second psalm, readers of this book are awarded a model set forth by the words of God himself. The model of one God, one king, one mountain, all three of them eternally set in place in perfect harmony with each other, with no specific task at hand, but to remain as they are. No more an intervening voice. God's voice is here a forceful affirmation and reaffirmation of the current state of affairs, the current king and royal dynasty, and the current relationship between God and king. In other words, God's words, as recounted here by the poet, serve as a site of the ultimate ideological strategy, the portraying of sovereign power as natural, everlasting, and simply expressing the truth of the land, like a map corresponding to territory or a dress corresponding to the body it is clothing. But the psalm doesn't stop here, nor does God's active part in it. אספרה אל חוק, אדוני אמר אליי, בני אתה, אני היום ילידיתיך, שאל ממני ואתנה גויים נחלתך, ואחוזתך אפסי ארץ, תרועם בשבט ברזל, ככלי יוצר תנפצן. Here God speaks again, or rather is quoted by the speaker of these verses, who seems to be the king himself. It's clear that the main goal of this second speech is to strengthen the ideological claim of the previous verses we read. God is portrayed as he who not only mocks the other unruly kings, but also as he who expresses a personal affection to the righteous king himself. In fact, God literally goes out of his way in order to impress his approval on his listeners. He emphasizes the intimate, familial relationship with the king, and the fact that he chooses the king today, ani hayom yeliditicha, and even accords a king with a special ability, just ask, and you shall be given. And if all this wasn't enough, God's words are accompanied by a clear spatial orientation. He speaks to the king as though calling him, inviting him to see things as he, God, sees them, namely from above, from a high stronghold, a place which can allow him to smash his enemies below as a potter does to his lowly jars. So the move from verse 6 to verses 7 and 8 is the move from mocking foreign kings towards embracing the chosen king. It is also a move from an outspoken God to an inspoken God, a God who commends his beloved ones generously, regardless of external threats. It would seem that these moves will just strengthen the bond between God and his king, only fortify further the Davidic royal ideology. But I'd like to suggest that it is this move from outside in, from laughing to begetting, that demonstrates not only ideological reassurance, but also a breach within this very same ideology. A breach which leads to the apprehension of the impossibility of the identification between divine and earthly sovereignty. Where does this breach appear? Well, let's look again at verse 7. What's so striking here is that before God's words are presented, the king says that he must say, as is due, asapara el chok. He's trying to say, I'm his chosen one, he speaks to me, but he's also saying, you will hear God's words, but you'll hear them as I say them, according to my law, my duty. In other words, the king quotes God, but not as a prophet who succumbs to some overpowering divine revelation, but rather as one who is practically in charge, in command of the divine voice, as one who expects the divine word to succumb to his duties. In a way, this move of the king, this appropriation of God's words, is yet another example of what Jacques Derrida called the logic of the supplement. The supplement, that dangerous supplement, as he calls it, that is always added in the last-ditch attempt at fortifying some eternal truth. The same supplement that always does the opposite and opens up more issues than it closes off. The move from verse 6 to verse 7 is a classic example of this supplemental logic. But I'd like to stay with Derrida for one more moment and suggest that maybe instead of the supplement, we might find more use in a different term Derrida used later in his life. I'm referring to one of his key concepts in his later work, the autoimmune, or autoimmunity. This term emerges in Derrida's work from the 90s and on, as he addresses with great force and persuasion matters of political, religious, and ethical importance. Through the concept of the autoimmune, Derrida joins Carl Schmitt and others in the investigation of the theological foundations of Western sovereignty. Derrida's unique part in this conversation is exemplified by the concept of the autoimmune. What autoimmunity means for Derrida, in the most general and succinct way, is the drive or the necessity of any system, and especially systems of sovereignty, to turn on their own defenses. This breaching of the defense is necessary. It must happen. It must happen, Derrida explains, because sovereignty is always caught up in a double bind. It needs to be a blank, complete force preceding any law or institution, but it also needs those very same laws and institutions in order to justify itself. The sovereign is he who must be able to cancel laws, refute institutions and norms, but he always ends up using those same institutions and norms while trying to fortify once and for all his rule. In Derrida's own words, this is from his book Rogues, translated to English as Rogues. To confer sense or meaning on sovereignty, to justify it, to find a reason for it, is already to compromise its deciding exceptionality, to subject it to rules, to some general law, to concepts. It is to compromise its immunity. This happens as soon as one speaks of it in order to give it or find it some sense or meaning. But since this happens all the time, pure sovereignty does not exist. It is always in the process of positing itself by refuting itself, by denying or disavowing itself. It is always in the process of auto-immunizing itself, of betraying itself. Is it far-fetched to borrow Derrida's gaze at Western democracy and utilize it in the ancient Israelite context of the Book of Psalms? I think not. I believe that the Hebrew Bible's own ambivalence towards questions of divine and human sovereignty in fact demand a reading of these royal psalms with an open eye and ear to the cracks in the system. Those same cracks for which Derrida's deconstructive technique provides sound methodological grounds. More specifically, I think these poems carry within them not only ambivalence, but indeed an unconscious drive toward the dismantling of this very same palace they're trying to fortify. This autoimmune drive is nowhere more evident than in the two verses we just read in Psalm 2, verses 6 and 7. In verse 7, the king quotes God's birth proclamation. By doing so, this king attacks and undermines the foundation upon which his royalty stands, which is God's ultimate highness, God's existence outside any system of duties, laws, and interests. If God does not speak, but is quoted, if he is quoted by a human being bound to some duty or law, if he's quoted as being a father, eternally and biologically bound to his offspring, and if he allows that offspring to make demands of him, well, quite simply, the king has unseated the sovereign God who bestows power upon him and upon earth. And so it happens that the royal psalms are not just a site of an unusual representation of God's voice. The appearance of this reaffirming, present-oriented divine voice is no mistake or curiosity. It is an outcome of what Derrida calls that illogical logic of the autoimmune. It is the only voice that could appear while the king tries to assume the sovereign position once and for all, is the term that Jonathan referred to. Once and for all, at once and for an unbreakable eternity. a voice of a triumphalist ideology carrying within it, as if stowed away or repressed, the signs of its own defeat. And then, there is that other royal psalm, that unique and tantalizing poem, which is Psalm 89, the poem in which the hidden and the repressed returns. For while the breach of the sovereign in Psalm 2 is hidden, lurking in the stylistic or metaphorical aspects of the discourse, Psalm 89 proves to be an exception. For Psalm 89 does not only contain the logic of autoimmunity, it dramatizes it. This startling psalm is too long for us to read in its entirety, so with your permission, I'll focus on the verses in which this dramatization is most evident, and we begin with verse 20, where God's voice is incorporated into the poem. אז דיברת בחזון לחסידיך ותאמר, שיוויתי עזר על גיבור, הרימותי בחור מעם, מצאתי דוד עבדי, בשמן קודשי משכתיו, הוא יקראני אבי אתה, אלי, וצור ישועתי, אף אני, בכור אתנהו, עליון למלכי ארץ, לעולם אשמור לו חסדי ובריתי נאמנת לו, זרעו לעולם יהיה וכסאו השמש נגדי, כירח ייכון עולם, ועד בשחק נאמן, סלע. God's voice in these verses sounds similar to the voice we heard in Psalm 2. And once again, it is a quoted voice, a retelling of a hearing that happened sometime and is now brought into play in order to strengthen the king's hold on the throne. But as it turns out, this quoted divine vow to uphold eternal sovereignty is but a prologue to what follows. And what follows is an earth-shattering lament, a poem of a loss of hold on the crown and on the land. And this is the continuation of the same song. Ve'ata, says the poet now, and not God, referring to God. Ve'ata zanachta v'tim'as, התעברת עם משיחך, נערת ברית עבדיך, חיללת לארץ מזרוע, פרצת כל גדרותיו, שמת מבצריו מחיתה. עד מה אדוני תסתר לנצח, תבער כמו אש חמתך. זכור אני מחלד, על מי שב ברת החול בני אדם, מי גבר יחיה ולא יראה מוות, ימלט נפשו מיד שאול סלע. איה חסדיך הראשונים, אדוני, נשבעת לדוד באמונתך. זכור אדוני חרפת עבדיך, עשיתי בחיקי כל רבים עמים, אשר חרפו אויביך אדוני, אשר חרפו עקבות משיחך, ברוך אדוני לעולם, אמן ואמן. By the way, the 12th century exegete of Avraham ben Ezra, in his commentary, says there was this famous Chacham Sfaradi, a wise Spanish Jew, who refused to recite this song, as he saw it too tantalizing, in his attack towards God. The complaint in these verses is simple and devastating. The speaker of the poem, the same speaker who quoted God's promises, now acknowledges that the promise had been broken. What's striking in this supplement to the divine voice is the speaker's honest admittance of the autoimmune within the immune, the breach within the fortification. This appears not only in the mere juxtaposition of the promise and the lament, it also appears in the way the later lament rewrites and rearranges the very same imagery that appeared in the initial promise, thereby admitting that those same initial images actually contain the potential of their own deconstruction. This rewriting is most evident in the way the speaker of the lament treats the imagery portraying the relationship between God and king. When God speaks in verses 20 and 21, he begins by saying he found the king, anointed him, and set a crown on his head. Shiviti Ezer, alter translated as a crown. It could also be understood as some sort of bravery or some other title. These images are fairly simple images of a political relation between God, who's the ultimate sovereign, and the king, who's his representative. But God's speech doesn't stop here. He goes on, adds on, supplements the coronation image with images of a familial biological nature. This happens in verses 27 through 38. In these verses, God's relation to the king is depicted as an embrace an enriching of sea, and finally, a setting of the king as an eternal star in the firmament. However, when the lament commences, all fatherly or cosmic imagery dissolves, and God's relation to the king is rewritten. The God of the lament is neither he who was a father, nor he that embraced. He's the one who has broken a pact and thrown the crown to the ground. To be sure, these two divine gestures are very painful and humiliating, but at the same time they underscore the fact that the prior images just went too far, ventured too enthusiastically into a binding of God to the anointed king. The speaker of the lament is no doubt in great pain, but he's also in a way cured from the attempt to rein in God's voice and presence for the sake of one specific royal lineage. He acknowledges now, and after a great amount of suffering, that God is allowed to intervene, to take the crown off just as he can put it on, and that God's voice cannot be appropriated fully by any human endeavor. Yet one must acknowledge the fact that Psalm 89 does not go so far as to claim that the ties with God had been severed. Quite the contrary, the last part of Psalm 89 presents us with a sorrowful, hurt, yet honest opening up towards God. Read from the ending backwards, one can see that the earlier quotes of the divine vows threaten to close off any possibility of change, of otherness, of an unforeseen divine event, and that these are reopened in the lament as a view to the future, to the great other who is God. A God which can be reined in, but can be addressed, wondered at, and hoped for. As Derrida points out in his discussion of the autoimmune, suppressing the initial defense of the body may weaken it, but it also allows the body to accept a foreign organ, an otherness, a future life which those initial defenses just couldn't deal with. Perhaps this is how the last verse of this psalm should be heard. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen. Blessed be he for the time yet to come, the future, unforeseen, the otherness we cannot imagine yet. And so it happens that Psalms 2 and 89 place the Judean king in a frustrating position. On the one hand, he's the chosen one, the one anointed on the mountain. But on the other hand, this king of the mountain is also just far enough from God as to allow the repressed countercurrents to resurface and distance him from any eternal, sure-footed stand. But this same frustrating position is also a fruitful one. For the king might encounter devastating questions, but those same questions might reopen his vital relationship with God. If the king enters these psalms as one confident of his blessing, his royalty, or if you would, his highness, the disrupting voices that follow in the poems reproach him, but also soften him and open him to otherness. And since we began with the notion of a disquieting voice, allow me to add such a voice to the end of this journey. This same dialectic of those confident of their own that discover otherness and are opened by it is well portrayed by no other than Bob Dylan. I'm referring to one stanza from the Ballad of a Thin Man, a stanza which is a sound critique of anyone assuming that they are in hold of their own highness. You raise up your head and ask, is this where it is? And somebody points to you and says, it's his. And you say, what's mine? And somebody else says, well, what is? And you say, oh my God, am I here all alone? Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was very interesting. So I'd just like to clarify something. So to my understanding, you began with using examples of God's voice in prose, showing how it's interventive, and then you moved to Psalm 2 as poetry, and specifically when the psalmist quotes God, you said you employed Derrida to say there was sort of an unsovereigning of God, right? There's some sort of break there. So with that, I'm curious what you do with, since we're treating this almost canonically, another genre of biblical literature, prophecy. I'm wondering how useful this methodology would be in analyzing prophetic works and all the times it says, who am I?
Well, as I said in the beginning, what I'm interested in is and this might prove to be too big a project, but what I'm interested in is a typology of the literary uses, literary and ideological uses of God's voice. I think what we find as Psalms is different. It's completely different from what we find in prophecy. And I hinted at it when I said that one of the major differences is the fact that prophets present themselves and the narrative presents them as those who succumb to the word, while the king in these royal psalms is the one who sort of picks it up at his ease, and that's a major difference between them. Prophecy is a whole different story. So I'm very intentionally didn't address it. What you can understand is that unlike we heard of this yesterday in a few lectures, unlike later exegetists who believe firmly that the book of Psalms is a book of prophecy, I probably disagree.
Thank you, this was superb. Partly you already answered the question I wanted to ask. Isn't for Derrida this autoimmunity inherent in all texts? And therefore, so you said this is very different. You located it at a very specific place. How do you deal with this?
Well, it's true that as far as I can understand, it's a difficult concept. But it's true that it appears in any text. In that sense, it's just yet another Derridian concept, like deconstruction, like difference, like which you can find. But what's interesting, and what a few of Derrida's commentators say about this specific, the move from deconstruction to autoimmunity, is it's a very dramatic move, very surprising, I must say, that Derrida, of all people, would use a biological metaphor. And I think what he's trying to do is break the boundaries of texts and reach towards the specific sites that interest him, especially sites of sovereignty. It's true that not only nation sovereignty, but also the sovereignty of the self, the sovereignty of God, and so on. But I think specifically the autoimmune is most useful in those kinds of readings. I mean, theoretically, you could use a concept reading any psalm, but I think with these royal psalms so intent on producing and affirming sovereignty, that's where it becomes most fruitful.
Wonderful. It was a great session, and thank you all.